In this episode, we move from the broad overview of risk assessment into one of the most important practical skills in the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) journey, which is learning how to identify risk events and understand the conditions that make those events more likely or more damaging. For a brand new learner, this is where risk management starts to feel less like a set of abstract ideas and more like a disciplined way of seeing what could go wrong in a real organization. Many people hear the word risk and immediately think of something bad that has already happened, but risk management is really about recognizing plausible future events before they turn into loss, disruption, embarrassment, or legal trouble. That means the quality of everything that comes later, including analysis, reporting, treatment, and monitoring, depends heavily on whether the organization has identified the right events in the first place. If the event is misunderstood, described poorly, or disconnected from business reality, then even a well-intentioned response can aim at the wrong target and leave the organization exposed in ways leadership never clearly saw. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is with the meaning of a risk event, because beginners often mix it up with related ideas like threats, vulnerabilities, assets, or controls. A risk event is a specific occurrence or condition that could affect the organization's ability to achieve its objectives, and that definition matters because it connects technology concerns to business outcomes. A threat is something that can cause harm, such as a malicious actor, a natural disaster, or a system failure, while a vulnerability is a weakness that can be exploited or triggered, and an asset is something the organization values. The risk event sits in the middle of that picture because it describes what might actually happen when conditions line up in a meaningful way. A phishing message by itself is not yet the full event, and a weak password policy by itself is not the full event either. But a compromised employee account that leads to unauthorized access to financial data is a risk event because it describes an actual harmful occurrence with business consequences. That distinction is essential because organizations do not manage raw pieces of information in isolation. They manage the possibility of events that can disrupt operations, expose data, affect customers, or create financial and reputational harm. Once that definition is clear, it becomes easier to understand why identification is so important. If an organization describes risk in vague language, such as system weakness or vendor problem, decision makers may know something is wrong, but still have no clear idea what they are supposed to worry about. Clear event identification gives shape to the discussion by showing what could happen, where it could happen, and why leadership should care. That clarity supports prioritization because not every weakness leads to the same kind of event, and not every event produces the same kind of damage. A missing patch in a low-value test system may matter far less than a minor seeming process flaw in payroll, emergency communications, or customer authentication. Risk identification, therefore, is not just about generating a long list of possible troubles. It is about expressing exposure in a way that helps people distinguish between background noise and meaningful business threats. When the event is stated well, the organization can analyze impact, compare exposure across areas, assign ownership, and make more thoughtful decisions instead of reacting emotionally to the loudest technical finding. One of the best ways to identify risk events is to start from what the organization is trying to accomplish rather than starting only from what technology it owns. Businesses exist to deliver products, support operations, serve customers, protect information, and meet financial, legal, and strategic goals. So the most useful risk events are the ones that describe what could interfere with those goals. That means a risk professional should ask what processes matter most, what data is most sensitive, what systems support essential functions, and what dependencies would create serious disruption if they failed. A learner who starts only with a list of servers or applications may collect a lot of technical facts without seeing which events truly threaten the business. Starting from objectives changes the perspective. Instead of asking only whether a system has a weakness, you begin asking whether that weakness could prevent order fulfillment, delay patient care, interrupt payments, expose regulated data, or undermine a critical service promise. This is one reason mature risk identification is more useful than simple issue spotting. It helps the organization connect potential events directly to the real-world consequences leaders are responsible for managing. Risk events can come from many directions, and good identification depends on recognizing that not all of them are dramatic cyber attacks. Some events are caused by outside actors, such as ransomware, fraud, denial of service attempts, or data theft. Others come from inside the organization through human error, weak change control, poor configuration, accidental deletion, careless handling of sensitive information, or breakdowns in oversight. Some arise from third parties, such as a cloud outage, software defect, vendor breach, or service failure in a critical partner. Still others are driven by physical or environmental forces, such as fire, flood, power loss, or facility disruption, especially when those events affect systems the business depends on. A beginner sometimes makes the mistake of thinking risk identification should focus only on malicious behavior, but a mature organization knows that accidental events, operational failures, and process weaknesses often create just as much damage. A serious outage caused by an internal misconfiguration can hurt customers and revenue just as much as an external attack, which is why the identification process has to stay broad enough to capture all meaningful sources of exposure. At this stage, it helps to introduce the idea of contributing conditions, because risk events rarely appear out of nowhere. A contributing condition is a factor that increases the likelihood that a risk event will occur, increases the impact if it does occur, or reduces the organization's ability to detect, contain, recover from, or respond to the event effectively. These conditions may be technical, procedural, human, organizational, or environmental, and they often explain why one company suffers a serious incident while another facing a similar threat does not. Weak access controls, outdated systems, unclear roles, poor logging, rush changes, limited staff training, over-reliance on a single vendor, and weak backup discipline are all examples of contributing conditions. On their own, they are not always the event itself, but they shape the environment in which the event becomes possible or becomes much worse. This idea is central to good risk thinking because it prevents the organization from treating events as random bad luck. Instead, it encourages a deeper look at the conditions that made the event plausible, which is where real learning and meaningful improvement usually begin. Contributing conditions can be easier to understand when you think about them as the surrounding circumstances that help bad outcomes gain momentum. Imagine a business that depends on a customer portal to generate revenue. If the portal is attacked, the event may be service disruption or unauthorized access, but several conditions may have been quietly supporting that outcome long before the incident occurred. The portal might rely on old software that is hard to patch. The authentication process might be weaker than it should be. Monitoring may be limited after business hours, and ownership for exception approvals may be unclear. None of those conditions by itself guarantees a serious incident, but together they create an environment where the event is more likely and harder to control once it begins. This is why contributing conditions matter so much in risk identification. They move the conversation beyond a single obvious weakness and help the organization understand the broader pattern that turns a manageable problem into a significant business issue. One of the most important lessons for new learners is that risk usually builds through combinations rather than isolated failures. Organizations often do not suffer major loss because of one giant weakness that everyone somehow missed. More often, they suffer because several smaller conditions align at the same time, each one making the other more dangerous. A team may have incomplete asset visibility, weak administrative review, slow patch cycles, and limited incident rehearsal, and together those factors can turn a manageable threat into a damaging event. This layered reality is one reason strong risk assessment requires thoughtful judgment instead of simple checklists. A checklist may confirm that certain controls exist, but it may not reveal how weak ownership, outdated procedures, and poor recovery preparation could interact during a real disruption. By paying attention to combinations of contributing conditions, the organization becomes better at recognizing fragile areas before an event exposes them. That way of thinking also prepares you for later topics in the course, because risk scenarios, root cause analysis, and treatment decisions all depend on understanding how conditions combine to shape the likelihood and impact of future events. Identifying risk events and contributing conditions requires more than sitting in a room and guessing, although informed discussion is certainly part of the process. Organizations usually learn from a mix of evidence sources, including incident history, near misses, audit findings, vulnerability reviews, architecture discussions, process walkthroughs, change records, vendor assessments, operational metrics, and conversations with people who actually run the business. Each source tells part of the story, but none should be treated as the whole picture. A technical scanner may reveal weak configurations, but say little about the business process that depends on the system. A process owner may understand operational impact very well, but may not see the technical condition that makes an event likely. A help desk trend may reveal repeated issues that seem minor until someone connects them to weak identity controls or unstable change practices. Strong identification work pulls these threads together and looks for recurring patterns, hidden dependencies, and conditions that make important business services more fragile than leaders may realize. Another skill that matters here is learning to separate the event, the condition, the symptom, and the outcome, because these are often confused in early risk discussions. Suppose employees repeatedly report delayed access to a critical system after changes are made. The symptom might be the access problem people are noticing, while the contributing condition could be poor change review, weak testing, or unclear approval responsibility. The risk event might be a failed access control change that blocks essential business activity or creates unauthorized permissions, and the outcome could be service interruption, financial loss, audit findings, or customer harm. When these ideas get blended together, organizations struggle to decide what exactly should be analyzed or fixed. Good risk identification creates cleaner thinking by naming each part of the chain more accurately. That matters for CRISC because the exam often expects you to understand causation and business effect, not just technical symptoms. In practice, clear distinctions also make it easier to assign ownership and choose a treatment approach that addresses the real source of exposure rather than just the visible inconvenience. As organizations become more mature, they often document risk events in the form of short, structured statements or scenarios that explain what could happen and what business area would be affected. A useful event statement is specific enough to be meaningful without pretending to predict every detail. It usually describes the source or trigger, the affected system, process, or data, and the consequence that leadership should care about. For example, instead of writing that there is weak vendor management, a stronger statement would explain that a critical service provider outage could interrupt customer transactions and delay revenue collection during peak business periods. That kind of wording helps decision makers understand not just that a weakness exists, but why the event deserves attention. Contributing conditions can then be attached to that event as supporting context, such as limited redundancy, weak contract terms, or unclear escalation paths. This level of documentation becomes extremely useful later when the organization builds a risk register, compares exposure across departments, and determines which issues require deeper analysis or a formal response decision. There are several common mistakes beginners make when identifying risk events, and avoiding them can improve both exam performance and real-world judgment. One common mistake is treating every vulnerability as if it were already a fully defined risk event, which usually creates a flood of technical details without enough business meaning. Another is focusing only on dramatic external threats while ignoring process breakdowns, accidental errors, weak governance, or third-party dependency. Some learners also assume that if an event has never happened before, it can safely be ignored, but risk management is about plausible exposure, not only historical repetition. Past incidents are valuable clues, but they do not define the full universe of future events, especially when technology, business models, and threat conditions keep changing. Another mistake is identifying events without considering contributing conditions, which can make analysis seem shallow and reactive. When the organization sees only the event and not the conditions surrounding it, it may respond with a narrow fix and miss the deeper weaknesses that allow similar events to happen again later. This topic also connects naturally to communication, because the value of identifying a risk event is lost if nobody can understand the description or see why it matters. Executives usually do not need an avalanche of technical wording. They need a clear explanation of what could happen, what business objective is at risk, what conditions make the event plausible, and why the organization should care now rather than later. A useful description is grounded, realistic, and connected to consequence. It avoids language that is so generic that it could apply to anything, and it also avoids over-dramatizing every issue into a crisis. This balance is important because effective risk communication helps leaders compare exposure and make decisions under uncertainty. If the event is explained too softly, it may be ignored, but if it is framed too dramatically without support, trust in future reporting can weaken. Good identification therefore supports good communication by giving decision makers a stable, defensible picture of what the organization is facing. As you continue through Domain 2, you will see that identifying risk events and contributing conditions is not the final destination, but the starting point for deeper assessment work. Once the event is clear, the organization can analyze likely loss, estimate business impact, explore threat patterns, assess control deficiencies, and build risk scenarios that support prioritization and treatment. If the event is poorly identified, all of those later steps become weaker because they are built on an unstable foundation. That is why experienced risk professionals spend time refining the event description and examining the conditions around it instead of rushing immediately to scoring or remediation. They know that a well-defined event can reveal ownership, dependencies, and likely consequences far more effectively than a vague statement ever could. In that sense, event identification is not a preliminary paperwork exercise. It is the moment where uncertainty starts becoming understandable enough for the organization to respond intelligently and consistently. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson should be clear that risk events are the meaningful occurrences or conditions that could interfere with the organization's objectives, while contributing conditions are the surrounding factors that make those events more likely, harder to detect, or more damaging when they occur. Strong risk identification begins with business reality, draws on multiple sources of evidence, and pays close attention to how technical, human, process, and third-party factors combine. It avoids the trap of treating isolated weaknesses as the whole story, and it aims instead to describe plausible events in language that supports analysis, ownership, and decision-making. This is one of the most valuable habits you can build in CRISC because it strengthens every later step in the risk process. When you can identify the event clearly and explain the conditions shaping it, you are no longer just observing scattered problems. You are helping the organization see its exposure in a disciplined way that makes better judgment, better communication, and better risk treatment possible.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.